On to our ESG panel discussion. I'll just quickly introduce our panelists because you've met most, in fact, all of them already this week. John Welborn, Director at Apollo Minerals. Dalitso Banda, Principal at Bennett Co, who spoke yesterday. And Clare Pope, Partner, Legal and ESG Co-Lead, which is convenient for this discussion, at PwC, who's also joined us on the Critical Minerals panel yesterday. It's an interactive session. So if you've got any questions, please, we've got about we've got 40 minutes, in fact, so we've got time to tackle any of the issues. I've put it out on Twitter and LinkedIn as well, and there's a few people who've come past with some questions and some comments. So please, and I know there's a lot of people on the African continent who are going to be watching this on the live stream or later on this evening, are really interested on the topic and to hear the points and from our panelists. So please make sure we keep the conversation flowing. I'm going to have a sit down and join our panelists, and we'll get cracking. So I wanted to start really, ESG has been mentioned in probably every single conversation we've had on this stage this week. And while that's been the case for the last couple of years, it's certainly, I don't think there's anyone who would argue that it isn't a growing trend and a growing importance, this focus on ESG. So there's really sort of four areas that we'd like to try and cover today, because it's a vexed issue as well. The first, we would like to look at the challenging regulatory environment around ESG obligations and responsibilities, particularly in the wake of things like Samarco and Juukan Caves, and the example that Dalitso used yesterday of Vedanta in Zambia. Then I'd like to tackle the idea of the difference of approaches in capability in ESG reporting and auditing and accountability between majors, who have an army of ESG experts at their disposal, and smaller junior and mid-tier companies who perhaps don't have the capacity to report in the same way, which Claire, I think Christy Porter covered really well yesterday. Then we want to have a look at the difference in expectations on ESG performance and obligations between shareholders, who are usually Western international groups, versus stakeholders, particularly on the ground in Africa, in particular, host communities and governments, and what they expect out of ESG compliance, if you like. And then finally, if we get time, though I'm wasting a lot of it here already, is looking at the investment opportunity. I mean, ESG is so often been seen as a stick to beat companies, but perhaps there's a brighter future in front of us. So, Dalitso, I'd like to start with you. You mentioned in your presentation yesterday that there was new regulatory legal requirements emerging in the US and in the EU regarding disclosure, reporting and auditing of ESG performance from corporations. What's the legal situation in Australia at the moment in that regard? And should Aussie companies, miners and explorers in particular, should they be preparing themselves to adjust to that shift in regulatory burden, if you like?
Yes, thank you. Very good question. So in the US, particularly with the election of Joe Biden and the Biden administration, there's been an increasing focus on ESG. So the SEC has set up a task force which is going to be reporting on potentially new rules at the end of the year. And in the EU as well, there's new regulations regarding disclosure and reporting standards and auditing requirements. In Australia, there's nothing specific yet, as far as I know, but the trend is that ESG-specific disclosure will be required. In terms of what companies can do is, you can learn from other jurisdictions, such as the US and the EU, but ultimately it comes down to quality of information. So for market participants, what they want to know and understand is how are companies factoring ESG in the decision-making processes, how are they monitoring those ESG risks, how are they verifying those matters. So even under the current regulatory framework in Australia, I think so far as materiality of information is concerned, I think the regulations here sufficiently, at least in a broad sense, cover the requirement to provide quality, accurate information around ESG.
Claire, did you have anything to add to that? It strikes me that in the Australian context, probably most of our environmental and mining regulations are already covering many of those elements of, and for that matter, native title regulations are covering lots of those elements already.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. We are a highly regulated environment here in Australia, and most likely, like Dalitso mentioned, where issues will arise is more in relation to the disclosure obligations that you have as a listed company. And we even saw last week the case that's been launched against a major oil and gas company around whether or not some of the statements they've made to the market about their operations might be misleading and deceptive. And if that case progresses through the courts, that's probably going to be one of those watershed moments where we reflect back and go, actually, that was the inflection point in Australian public company history.
John, I see you furiously scribbling away there. That might suggest that you've got some thoughts on this matter. You in your current role at Apollo, you're really just starting the journey and building the ESG story in Gabon. How are you? Where do you take that model from? How do you build that?
Well, look, I thought my role on this panel was to be the dirty miner who complains. Conferences of this nature are usually a forum for miners to complain of over-regulation and red tape and the difficulty that we're having in being restricted from tearing the earth apart and extracting its minerals for the benefit of our shareholders. So unsurprisingly, I'm going to disappoint on that regard. But and in answering that question specifically about Apollo Minerals, I do think there's an opportunity for smaller exploration companies to be a significant piece in this ESG landscape. And I spoke yesterday in my presentation about how proud I am to be a member of the broader group that the Minister of Mines of Western Australia spoke about in terms of 95 listed companies focused on 150 odd projects in Africa. And I think across that, to generalise, I think our performance and the way we operate as Australian companies in Africa, which is this conference all about, is very consistent with the principles that are espoused by all various ESG-focused voluntary and regulatory requirements. So having said that, and I do think, though, that the concept of disclosure and reporting is very complex. You've mentioned one of the things to cover is that distinction between reporting and reality. And I think Dalitso's great comment at the start of his presentation yesterday was to define ESG as doing the right thing, which I think is really useful. Just a couple of comments before I talk specifically about Apollo Minerals. I went through a real journey when I first started at Resolute in ESG, and if anyone is interested in that ESG journey, you can look at Resolute's first sustainability report, which was published in February of this year. And in fact, on Resolute's stand outside this conference hall, one of the panels is value by sustainability. And I have some pride as a former managing director that ESG journey and the journey to that disclosure document, which was involved really 3 years of preparation and work, is now evidence, and I think it's a good example. And just to summarise it, what actually comes out of that is that Resolute are actually disclosing that they're 50% compliant with the World Gold Council's responsible gold mining principles, which at one level is pretty poor outcome. I think in previous parts, companies have wanted to stand up and say we're completely compliant and we're fantastic. The reality is that, particularly if you look at carbon footprint, as a miner, there's a huge journey to go, and disclosure isn't about beating your chest and doing what a lot of us have done at this conference for more than a decade, is stand up and show a photograph of some happy kids holding some school books and say that we're totally ESG gurus. To come back to the point I was going to make, I'm a chartered accountant, and I'm increasingly frustrated by arguments I have with auditors where the accounting principles make the actual result of putting information in front of people for the purpose of them to assess it, sometimes laboriously difficult and almost misleading by following accounting principles. And I think the ESG pathway and disclosure can be similar. And that's why, coming back to your question about Apollo Minerals, sometimes it's a lot easier for the little companies just to focus on doing the right thing. No one has invested more, or not many companies have invested more in reporting and ESG requirements than a company like Rio Tinto, and yet they're the example everyone would say is a monumental failure in what we saw here in Jukan Gorge. And there's a disconnect there in terms of the reporting balancing with the activity of doing the right thing. And I think that's very important. Another example of that, before I pass back, is just locally, not focusing on Africa. When I first joined Resolute, the company was about to close the Ravenswood gold mine in Queensland. And in fact, when I arrived, it had several months left to go, and we were about to move into a care and maintenance rehabilitation plan. It was incredibly concerning for me to understand that in the history of white settlement in Australia, in what is, along with Western Australia, one of the more advanced mining jurisdictions, being Queensland, with a long history of all sorts of bulk and precious metal mining, no company had ever successfully handed the keys back on a mining project in Queensland, and still to this day they haven't. And it's the unintended consequence of environmental regulation. It is simply impossible to rehabilitate or decontaminate a mining project in Queensland under the environmental regulation. What that actually means is that, and standard practice in Queensland from miners, large and small, is to avoid any genuine attempts at rehabilitation. As an African miner, I can point to lots of rehabilitation projects in exploration and operating mines. Resolute has progressively rehabilitated exploration areas, and Golden Pride in Tanzania is a wonderful example of an operating mine for 15 years, which was then totally rehabilitated. Infrastructure was given to the university, and the keys were handed back successfully to the government, and we actually the company, Resolute, won an award from the World Bank for that rehabilitation program. That sort of activity doesn't happen in Queensland because there's no reward to make that investment. So big companies tend to sell their projects at the end of the life to a smaller company to avoid getting stuck, or if they end up holding the keys, they effectively end up, without knowing it, funding the smallest amount possible ad infinitum with a view that you're never going to get back. No one would say that's ideal environmental management, whether you're an NGO or a miner. So to come back to that point about little companies and big companies, I think it's really important for ESG to focus on what Dalitso said, which is doing the right thing, and make sure that the regulation around reporting doesn't end up in that unintended consequence of the reporting taken over the reality of doing the right thing. I think at the small scale miners, it's a lot easier to make sure that you've got the endorsement of your local community, and ultimately you fit within a framework of the environmental and obligations which in Africa can often be self-imposed.
At that point there, John.
Sorry.
I don't need to ask any more questions
there, so I thought I'd get in early with.
I don't need to ask any more questions. We're just going to have a riff on what John's just said, and then we'll go from there. Dalitso, again, watching your presentation back this morning, I did notice that there was an area you didn't quite get to in the time allotted. Bill Witham was very strict on you. When that's on the directors' responsibilities and the risk to directors, do you feel that's a crucial point that the junior miners the boards of junior miners need to get their head around when it comes to ESG obligations? Yes,
absolutely. And I think listening to watching the Africa Awards yesterday, and Deep Yellow won the Emerging ESG Award sponsored by the Minerals Council, and what Deep Yellow said yesterday about establishing a culture right from the outset of identifying ESG issues, monitoring them. It's not always about immediate solutions, but starting really at the outset with a mindset to identify the issues, put a plan in place, set targets, provide accurate information about what you're doing is really important. So I think directors have an obligation in any event to understand what risks posed to the companies and put in place plans to deal with those risks. So it makes sense for juniors or people starting out to get into that mindset and that culture, because if you look at, for example, the principles for responsible investing, which has about $140 million trillion under ownership or management, the major investors in the world will be looking at how companies are dealing with ESG risks, how they're factoring in ESG factors in the decision-making process in order to invest in those businesses. So it's very important for junior companies in particular to do these things. And the other thing is the negative, I guess the negative benefit, which a lot of companies might not see upfront. So a good example is, the BP Deepwater Horizon situation. When you have a major ESG event, it can be catastrophic for a company. So for a small company or for a junior, which doesn't have the same sort of balance sheet as a BHP or a Rio or a Vale or a BP, it can mean the end of your business. So it's very important for directors to take ESG seriously, because it can be quite catastrophic.
Claire, Dalitso mentioned responsible investment principles. John mentioned the World Gold Council and its responsible mining principles. We have things like the Kimberley process. We have a new one, the copper mark, that's been set out for copper miners. And there's a whole host, Christy had in her presentation yesterday, a whole host of international standards and principles to stick by. How does a junior or mid-tier miner pick its way through
those standards?
Yeah,
and I kind of dismay at this concept of reporting against a standard, because that to me takes this back to a compliance culture discussion. And yes, that's part of the discussion, but just reporting against a standard doesn't actually mean you're living what you're doing. And to me, when we talk about ESG, it's aspirational, and perhaps it comes from a glass half full perspective, but it's the type of thing where you actually have to live what you want to do the right thing, have your social license to operate. Of course, in discussions with financiers and shareholders and stakeholders, they will have their various standards that they report to, and it's important to understand those. But it's also important to identify what's important to your project, what's important in your local area, what needs to be done. Throwing good money after professional services firms or whoever it is to write a great report actually might not be the most important thing. So let's concentrate on the foundations and get those right and actually shift the dial, rather than trying to please everybody, because there are, 2 or 3 or 5 different standards. A standard will come. We know that we'll have to report against it. But again, I think modelling ESG on a compliance culture isn't actually the right approach to take in the first place.
And is that emphasised in the dichotomy we often see between international investors and their priorities on ESG, whether it's reducing carbon footprint as a number one priority, or diversity in the workforce, particularly around gender, and what is the other stakeholders, whether it's host governments or host communities, are looking for out of ESG performance. It might be local content over gender diversity, or it might be more infrastructure over lowering the carbon footprint.
Yeah, it's a real tension, isn't it? Because there's competing priorities coming at you depending on the viewpoint of who's asking that particular question. And it will always be a balancing act. We can't be everything to everyone, because, nothing will get done if you're constantly trying to push back. I mean, there's some great metrics that came out in the last week. There's no longer an ASX-listed company in the top 200 that doesn't have a female board director. And that's great, and it's a significant achievement, and we should celebrate it. But each company, again, has got a different objective. It's got a different project. It's got different shareholders and stakeholders, and each jurisdiction that you're working in will have different things. So I think it comes back to Dalitso's point about, doing the right thing, establishing a social license to operate, and other things will flow from that. I'm not discounting that it's important. It is very important. And it's John wants the microphone back. You're not getting it. But an amazing statistic that you see is that as soon as directors go to jail for safety issues, all of a sudden safety is on the board's agenda. I don't actually think we need to move to that with ESG. I think people are on board with it. It's just doing it in a way that's manageable for that organisation. Do you want the microphone, John?
Oh, look, the conch, it's like it's red. Look, I have been enormously surprised by what Dom refers to as the dichotomy, and picking up on what you're talking about. The assumption is that doing the right thing is a pretty easy definition of ESG, and that you won't go wrong. I've sat in front of gold investors, particularly, and absolutely seen that remarkably significant investing groups in that space genuinely have no ESG interest. So while there is an increasing green investment funds and the view that there's value through sustainability and that investors are going to demand it, I was surprised, particularly in the gold space, to discover that in fact there's a huge class of investor that, if you were tipping cyanide in the river and it saved $100 out of your cost, well, just do that on the side. Alarmingly so. I've also sat in African jurisdictions where governments quite clearly are not focused, as we would expect, somewhat ironically from a mining point of view, on environmental obligations. And I say that because obviously there are lots of governments that are focused correctly, and it's great to see an increasing ESG investor. But increasingly, there is a role for mining companies to chart their own course and have their own, and that's why it is important for directors and boards to really think about and set the ESG agenda and not be responsive necessarily entirely to one particular part of the investor base, be it seen to be good or bad, and equally choose jurisdictions, but also not be overly responsible to the jurisdictional relevance. I think each and every miner and the industry has to set an increasingly difficult pathway based on a values and then fit that around their requirements.
Dalitso, did you have some comment to make on?
I agree with John. I think I don't think it's mutually exclusive in terms of what stakeholders, community stakeholders might want, and what investors might also desire. What companies need to do, as Claire has alluded to, is chart their own way. Obviously, you can't please everyone, but I think needing to identify those concerns, local concerns in particular, and dealing with them, because businesses operating in a community have to have a positive impact on that community. And when you get buy-in, local buy-in through positive impact, I think the business is more likely to succeed. And we've seen some really good examples, even in this conference, where there's large percentages of local employment, local content using local banks, and all that sort of stuff. It makes a huge difference to the way in which those communities perceive the business and how they relate to it. And when there's issues, the local communities come to the defense of the businesses, and that's what you want. So it's that the positive social impact, which is quite important. But ultimately, it's as John said, yes, doing the right thing is not easy to define, but everyone has a sense of what that might be or what might look like. So ultimately, I think it's important for businesses to understand that having I think I described yesterday as having a double bottom line approach, having a financial bottom line and a social bottom line is important.
And I think Walkabout Resources, one of the other companies that were awarded an award last night, is a great example of a company which, for all intents and purposes, is a Tanzanian company on the ground, and it's purely the capital that comes, and not even all the capital anymore, given that they've signed a debt agreement with a local bank, encapsulating the entire operation within the country. We haven't got much time left. I'm already looking at it. It seemed to jump forward about 10 minutes at one point while we were speaking. I mentioned at the very top the idea that ESG is always, and sustainability has always been a bit of a stick to beat miners with. And John, as you referred to, miners for a long time we're up there with weapons manufacturers and tobacco companies as one of the evils of the corporate world. But there is an opportunity to change that. Claire was on a panel with me yesterday discussing critical minerals, and particularly we see in the battery space the benefits that lithium or graphite or nickel or cobalt or rare earths can bring by being linked to that energy revolution. Do you think there's an opportunity for mining companies to use ESG as a positive investment rather than a negative, something to negate, but rather to use to promote the company as a positive investment opportunity?
Is that for Claire?
Yeah, Claire can take it forward.
I think, yes, in short, I think it's essential, and I don't think that's trying to greenwash or hide anything. But critical minerals really are part of the decarbonisation journey, and I would say ESG is also a journey as well. It is not that set and forget type model. You need to set your goals. You need to report transparently against those goals and whatever they might be. And even if your reporting statistics are we're 50% of the way there, well, you know what? That could be coming from a 0% base. So that's actually quite a lot of progress. And then you need to refine them over time. And I think that's what you'll find in the critical minerals space. That's really where it's headed. Just continuing on the journey and showing and demonstrating to the world that mining is essential and is part of the decarbonisation journey.
We're already seeing that is the answer. So then that's great. But I think it depends. It is somewhat ironic to see the different commodity focus. So if you're exposed in a rare earth or a battery metal, you can run an ESG agenda and be part of the decarbonisation of the planet. If you're a coal miner, then you are, to use your expression, the modern day cigarette manufacturer or arms manufacturer, or in fact worse. The fact that people who are buying Teslas are powering them by a brown coal-fired power station in Victoria is missed by their environmental focus. And so the mining industry has both a challenge and an opportunity to reinvent itself as a force for good across the ESG landscape, be it community focus and environmental focus. And it'll be fascinating to see how that unfolds. I think the investor landscape is going to change generationally at some point, and that will be a step change driver of where mining investment goes.
Dalitso, did you have anything to add before we open up the floor to questions?
No, I agree with both Claire and John. Essentially, there's an opportunity, and I think we've seen from some of the presentations that mine is already taking those opportunities. So we can probably open up for questions.
Well, we have got a couple of Carly and Kate are straight up ready to run around and get the microphone in front of you. Did we have any questions from the audience?
Hi, it's Peter here from UV. If you break down the ESG strategies, between what you do with reducing your environmental impact and what you're doing socially in the community, what focuses on those items change between different jurisdictions, maybe between Australia and Africa, or even different areas in Africa? In terms of, I think Alan from Walkabout mentioned yesterday, in Tanzania, there's a lot more focus on the social aspect. So my question is, how does the focus of mining companies change between different jurisdictions when it comes to ESG?
From an African perspective, and being somebody who was grown up and raised in a mining community in Africa, in Zambia in particular, the local concerns are more social. For companies operating, or for companies in Australia going into a place like Zambia or other African countries, the concerns are mostly social because of the high levels of poverty and that sort of stuff. So what mining companies need to do is identify what is of more concern to those particular communities. That is not to say that environmental issues should not be dealt with. But I think it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You have to go into a particular community, identify what the risks are, what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, and see how you can make a positive impact. And I think that's what Walkabout was talking about yesterday, which is, I think, a common approach.
Yeah, it's very jurisdictional. If you look at South Africa, it's the G of the ESG and the S clearly across that landscape: union involvement and transition of wealth and governance. If you look at Sudan, which by some accounts is either in the top 3 gold producers of Africa without any modern gold mining activity, I would say that the challenge there in ESG is the E. There's mercury going into the one water source of the Nile. There's a massive unregulated artisanal industry there, which is hugely environmental damaging. So they're just 2 examples. And again, it comes back, I think, to a combination of regulatory framework, government engagement, but then individual actions by the companies that are operating there. And to pick up on your question, there are different balances between the various elements of ESG depending on the commodity, the jurisdiction, and the local community.
I probably don't have much to add to what's been said, but if I come back to the point around reporting on this, I think the important thing is to be transparent. So you'll be reporting on what you're doing, whether it's the E or the S or the G, but failing to report on another area is probably something that should be considered, because it does open you up to that potential discussion around, greenwashing or some kind of misleading area. So that constant reporting, being transparent in your reporting and acknowledging not necessarily where you're not doing well, but at least putting it on the agenda as something that might be in the future that you're looking at doing, might sort of address how you get around, should you focus on E or S or G?
I think it's a very difficult question to ask because of the range of stakeholders. There's a booth outside on the Save the Rhino opportunity. If you talk to those people, clearly the fate of the rhinoceros will be very high on their agenda. It's their focus, and that's what they'll be talking about. Other people will say that every mining company, its number 1 priority should be carbon. And reporting on carbon and being responsible for global warming. Half the geologists here will have an argument about that and agree that there'll be some other focus. So that's the challenge of ESG and why this forum could go on forever and ever, because and why the framework around reporting is important to capture all of those balanced entities.
Great, thanks. Well, we've probably got time for one more comment quickly, or question. If there's no hands going up, we're going to pull the pin immediately because we've got the red zeros staring at us. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think we'll call it there. As John just said, we could go on for hours discussing this topic. It's a fascinating topic and one that there's plenty of opinions on, and it's a maturing discussion as well. I think each year that we've done anything on this subject, it's become a more mature conversation each time, and no more so than this year. And much of that is to do with the esteemed panelists that we've brought together today. So can you just join me in thanking Clare, Dalitso and John? Thank you very much.